Well, I want to thank Maxine not just for bringing us all together, but for being so open-minded and Catholic in her tastes, having here economic historians, art historians, historians of textiles, social historians, and even a historical sociologist, which would be me. And you may find the melding of historical materials and social science concepts that I bring a little bit jarring. If so, I apologize, but I'm very glad and honored to be invited to this group of people. I consider many of the people in the audience here kind of part of my team because I've learned so much from them. And I certainly I endorse what Jan's saying. The other major project that I've been working on the last few years, they're all 7 author papers, and we just couldn't get the work done otherwise. And I think that collaboration would be really helpful. I agree with everything Jan said. Ken and I have some very sharp disagreements, as only people who have been friends for a long time and agree on much else can. We certainly have both agreed that one of the goals of global history or world history is not just to change the way we do European history or the way we do Chinese history or the way we do Indian history or Latin American history, is to try and get a better sense of how all of these histories both relate to each other and can be put together in a different kind of coherent story than the one that we inherited when we went through our graduate school, the kind of Western civilization story. And I think Ken is absolutely right to say the point of using the words the Great Divergence is to underline what had been a strongly resisted notion of a broad similarity in level of material well-being, in level of commercial enterprise, in level of dynamism among major civilizations across Eurasia, such that the divergence in living standards that occurs in the 19th and 20th centuries is a divergence from what have appeared to be similar, even in many ways shared and overlapping trajectories, rather than the outcome of a distinctive European trajectory on the one hand and very different non-European trajectories on the other. Now, that said, where we have some disagreement is in the notions of what was behind this divergence. Was it a matter of Europe having access to colonies? Would it have been different if China had been able to send excess population into the Hunan Basin or into Guangdong in order to increase production? Or if China had encountered problems of pumping out coal mines in the north? Well, in fact, those things did happen, and I don't think it changed the history. So my notion is, as Ken said, one has to look backward at some of the factors that put Europe on a distinctive path, and we get into these questions of how distinctive was Europe, when did it become distinctive, in what way, was it cultural, was it institutional, was it material, all of these things that are so complicated that one has to turn to various modes of simplifying. And for a long time, we had a simplifying notion of the dynamic of Europe as driving world history. That is, the source of energy, as it were, pushing the global system, driving the interconnections, was European energy driving outward, with European peoples, European thought, and European actions flowing out to affect the world. I think that's profoundly mistaken, and that the more accurate story, the one that I'm trying to lay out, drawing on all these materials and perspectives, is what I would call a great inversion in historiography, that the real dynamism or motor of world history in the period from the 16th to the 19th century is one of a relatively backwards Europe that's struggling to overcome its material backwardness, driving history by seeking to increase the inward flow of goods and ideas from other parts of the world to Europe. And it's the acceleration of this inward flow of goods and ideas that triggers a revolution in Europe in the production and method of validation of knowledge that sets forth a new phase in world history. Now, I'd say that's a temporary one. Tim Brooks spoke yesterday of the fact that it's difficult to write history because we kind of know how it ends. That's silly. We don't know how it ends. We only know how it gets up to this point. Hegel and Max Weber thought that German bureaucracy was the end point of history. Gibbon and Macaulay thought that Whig liberalism was the end point of history. We think that if Fukuyama is right, that a kind of capitalist democracy is the end point of history, but we actually don't know any of that. My guess is that in the second half of the 21st century, when the main location of economic dynamism in the world is sub-Saharan Africa, they'll look back at the 20th century the way we look back at the 30 Years' War in the 17th century and say, that was a very unfortunate chapter and very costly, but of course we overcame that. We really don't know what lies ahead, but I think it's foolish for anyone to assume that we really know where history will take us or where it goes. What we can at best try and figure out are some of the patterns or motive forces that produced what we see to date. And we have to assume that those will continue to operate. And as the location of economic growth and advance has kept moving throughout history, it's very likely to continue to move. Now, when I say a relatively backwards Europe struggling to overcome that backwardness, it's quite striking. When you read the accounts of Cortes and his men who come to Tenochtitlan, or if you look at Clive's accounts of India, these are not accounts in which members of a superior civilization say, we have found these poor backward regions that we can plunder. They say, oh my God, these places are so fabulously wealthy. If we can just grab a little bit of this and take it home, we'll be terrifically rich compared to other Europeans. It's quite stunning, the rapacity, the avarice, the excitement you see in Europeans when they travel abroad. Very different from the reaction of Middle Easterners or Chinese who travel abroad and kind of say, ho hum, this is amusing, but we have all we need at home. Now, Jan de Vries had mentioned that in the course of the 16th and 17th century, as imports from Asia are absorbed into Europe, Europeans acquire a taste, even a dependence or an addiction on cotton, ceramics, spices, and other routine products of the East, and that there's an effort, an increasing effort of work, hours, industry, for Europeans to acquire these goods. I think Jan's absolutely right, but it goes further than that. Even the elites, the crowned heads, the nature scientists, the nature students of the time, wanted to acquire more. They sought to try and do what we call import substitution now. That is, much of the effort to understand the world and acquire new ways of learning, traveling, manufacturing was excited by the effort to try and produce equivalent goods. England wanted to be able to produce at first printed cottons and then cotton textiles, wanted to produce ceramics. Europeans wanted to be able to make fine china. They wanted to be able to voyage around the world and so on. Now, I've suggested that one way to try and understand what happened that started this new era is to take a look at growth in history and try and re-examine patterns of growth. The old notion of world history being driven by European dynamism treated growth in history as primarily extensive. That is, growth occurred when population increased or territory expanded, but there was little or no increase in output or income per capita. This extensive growth was the result of kind of a prevailing Malthusian ceiling. Whenever there was an increase in new land or new crops or new techniques, population growth would kind of quickly use up that marginal advantage and restore the prevailing level of income per capita. This was certainly what Angus Madison thought. I'm not as big a fan of Madison as Jan is, because a few years ago when I was looking at Madison's data, and I was looking at his data on China, and I thought, this is really remarkable. How does he get estimates of income per capita on China in order to get GDP figures for various periods from 1200, 1400, 1600, 1800? And then I decomposed his figures and found that what he had done is he had assumed a constant income per capita from 1200 to 1800 and simply got the best population figures he could find, and multiplied population by that constant income per capita to get those GDP figures. And then I later saw people using those GDP figures to argue that according to Madison, income per capita in China had remained unchanged for several hundred years. Pardon me? It may in fact be correct that if you look at the points in 1200 AD and 1800 AD, the income per capita may have been the same. It may have returned to those levels. I think that's actually reasonably close to correct. But we have Professor Li's detailed studies of agriculture in China, and if you ask, what difference did it make that the Chinese started double cropping rice? What difference did it make that they started using a lightweight, high-density bean cake fertilizer to improve yields? What difference did it make that they colonized the Hunan Basin in the upper Yangtze, which was a very high-yield area when first brought into production, and started sending that rice down the Yangtze in exchange for textiles? What did it mean to have regions specialize in cotton textile production? What did it mean to start double cropping mulberry trees for silk production in the interstices of paddies? Did all of that make no difference at all to income? Well, it's highly implausible, but if you simply assume that you can treat the endpoints as proxies for 600 years of developmental cycles, you don't see all that happened. So I think one has to be very careful about estimate and imputation, and it is precisely the kind of teamwork that Jan is now developing that will give us the data we need to do some more realistic assessments, identifying periods of growth and retrogression. I wanted to suggest that there are times when societies have poked through this Malthusian ceiling and experienced periods of genuine growth. Now, there's been a perverse tendency in some aspects of historical sociology and economic history to acclaim any such triumph over Malthusian barriers as the onset of innovation-driven income per capita increasing growth, and to call that modern. This has led to what I call the taffy pull extension of modernity, such that one finds roots, this early modern term has spread to encompass the entire world from 1500, because the world does indeed experience commercial expansion, specialization, and growth in income in this period. I've also seen some authors herald 1000 AD as the birth of the modern, noting that the medieval period is also a period, both in the Sung and in high medieval Europe, of great commercial expansion, intensification of agriculture, growth of urbanization, and so forth. But one could say the same thing about the Antonine period of the Roman Empire or classical Greece, and we would end up with the Parthenon being an example of modern architecture if we were to use this notion of modern growth as characterizing these periods throughout history. I don't think that will do. So I'm taking a term that I actually later learned was also used by Marshall Hodgson, who called these fluorescences, I call them an efflorescence, for a very specific idea, and that is, in an efflorescence, we see a period in which a territorial region experiences both population growth and per capita income growth or stability. Now, that's actually very unusual in history. Most places and most times, pre-industrially, do experience Malthusian limits, such that if population growth is sustained for more than half a century, income per capita starts to decline. That's the typical pattern, but there have been a number of periods in which that doesn't appear to be true, in which quite substantial gains in population and income are combined. We tend to think of those as kind of golden ages, the Abbasid Caliphate, late medieval Europe, Sung China, the early Qing, Renaissance Italy, Golden Age Holland. All of these are periods that the new economic history is starting to suggest to us have quantifiable growth in both population and income. And the pattern is usually one combining different types of growth. There are a number of innovations, either in agricultural or production technique. This gives a particular region a comparative advantage in production of some variety of product. They use that comparative advantage to expand their trade. They use that accumulated wealth to then expand or colonize other regions. And you have kind of this sustained period in which a particular region or civilization seems to grow and experience a higher level of income and production and output relative to its neighbors. But I believe that that actually still remains distinct from modern growth. The total real increase, even in these efflorescent periods, usually is on the order of about 1% a year, maybe a little more, but less than 2, about 1 to 1.5% a year. Now, as modern people, we're very jaded. You think 1% a year, why is that enough to transform a civilization? Well, here's a case where history and arithmetic have to come together. 1% growth, if sustained, is transformative. 1% growth sustained for 7 centuries produces about a 1,000-fold increase. So, for example, the population of Britain in about 1200 AD was probably around 6 million. If they sustained 1% annual growth to 1900, the population of Britain would have been 6 billion. Right? Didn't get there. 60 million today. So for most of history, population growth has been far, far less. Similarly, economic growth. If England had a per capita income of today's $1 per day, kind of the bare minimal, lowest level of global poverty, 1% annual growth would have made England as rich as the United States today by 1900. That is GDP per capita of around $30,000. Obviously, that didn't happen until still not quite as of today, and most of that growth was in the last 200 years. The reality is that most of the growth, and if I were able to do it, I'd put Jan's graphs back there. I don't know if you noticed, but if you looked at his graphs of GDP per capita, what was remarkable was not just the difference, say, between Java and Holland or between Holland and Britain, but that even for Holland, the most advanced corner of highly urbanized, internationally trading, commercialized Europe, the estimates of GDP capita are surprisingly flat century after century after century, except for the burst really in the late 16th, early 17th century. So that for most of pre-industrial history, population and income growth has been infinitesimal to minimal. Really very, very minor, except for brief periods in which growth gets from about 0.1% per year up to 10 times that for a few decades, and then peters out. Modern growth occurs when that 1% growth turns into 2%, 2.5%, and then continues at that level decade after decade after decade for up to 2.5 centuries. It's been that level of growth that has made the last 200 years an extraordinarily peculiar period in world history. And so I think the question we need to ask about patterns in world history and about divergence, and I think the divergence is very temporary because this shift from 0.1% average growth to 2% plus average growth has now taken place all over the world. Many places have had setbacks, but this shift from twin peaks to a single peak distribution is essentially the story of going from a world in which a number of civilizations and regions are experiencing sustained multiple percent growth where others are not, and then now to India and China, the bulk of the world's population, firmly in the multi-percent annual growth pattern. How does that happen? Given that there have been highly innovative and marked growth periods in civilizations, but they peter out. And I think there, before I peter out here, in time, the answer has to be found. I'm getting it. I'm going to take a little bit of advantage of catching up with my peers here, but I'm almost done. How do you move from a world of periodic invention and periodic technological growth to a period of sustained, systematic, ever-expanding circles of economic, technical, military growth. And there the answer, I believe, lies in fundamental changes in the way knowledge is acquired and validated. Now, we have another panel coming up on the history of science, so I don't want to lean too far into that material because I look forward to it myself. But I think that also is part of the Great Divergence story. We have a story of Western science that was falsely constructed as part of European triumphalism just as much as the imperial story, that treats Western science as something that came out of Greece, developed in Europe in the Middle Ages, flowered in the Renaissance, and came to full fruition in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's a very oddly skewed and inaccurate picture. A more accurate picture would be of multiple centers of global natural and mathematical study and inquiry that were all richly connected across Eurasia, and with quite striking selective appropriation and advances at different times. We still fall a little bit into the old language. A number of people, in talking about the Jesuit visit to China, talk about, the Jesuits brought European science, or they brought advanced science to China. It's completely untrue. When the Jesuits came to China, Newton's Principia was still half a century off. They were bringing baby science, kind of some of the first efforts of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo to move away from Ptolemy, efforts that were really deeply grounded in Arabic astronomy and mathematical efforts to revise and improve Ptolemaic and Alexandrian work. So by the time the Jesuits came to China, they had the benefits of Tycho Brahe's recent observations, and they had the benefits of the recent Gregorian calendrical reform. Muslim astronomers actually had done an even superior calendrical reform at the hands of Omar Khayyam somewhat earlier, but it hadn't survived some of the depredations of the Mongol and Ottoman periods, and so the Central Asian Muslim astronomers who had come to China were working with somewhat older observations. And so, as Professor Brooks said, it was very important for the Chinese emperor to know what was going on everywhere in the realm, and that particularly meant had to be able to predict eclipses. And if the Muslim calendrical philosophers were off by a full day in predicting an eclipse of the moon, whereas the European astronomers were able to predict it to within a few hours, well, that was enough to give a temporarily greater hearing to the Europeans. But the Europeans also were inferior in some of the other solar measurements. And it was a little bit later on, you get the story that the Jesuits find themselves being kicked out because they deny Newtonian science and stick with the Tycho Brahe model. Then the British Protestant missionaries come and say, those Jesuits, they've been giving you a bad line. Their story of the universe, that's wrong. They're giving you old, wrong science. And the Chinese basically throw up their hands and say, if these guys can't agree on what model of the solar system to give us, we're not going to listen to them. It's really not that important. We've got the models that we need, and they turn things back over to some of the Muslim and native Chinese astronomers who'd picked up the computational techniques quite readily. What's quite important, and I think most striking, and this is where I'll end, the Chinese had the confidence to adopt the computational techniques, the Brahe observations, whatever else they wanted from Western science. They were able to absorb that within their existing cosmological and philosophical traditions, and to move forward quite comfortably. The Europeans, however, were still saddled with a fairly rigid, somewhat dogmatic synthesis from Thomas Aquinas of the scriptural and Greek traditions that was fundamentally challenged by discovery of the New World, by discovery of new stars, by discovery of new phenomena, in such a way that the Europeans found themselves unable to reconcile their tradition and they could not selectively absorb the Arab, Indian, and new knowledge they got from the New World in a way that other civilizations could. When one last observation, When the European geographers brought their maps to China, they originally incurred the wrath of the Chinese emperor because they didn't show China at the middle of the world. But this was easily rectified because, after all, it was just a matter of shifting the depiction. You could do a Mercator projection showing the Pacific Ocean on one side, the Atlantic Ocean on the other, and spread North America so that China is restored to its central position. Once that was done, the Chinese were quite fine with European maps, didn't create a problem. But for European geographers, the New World crops, the New World geography, said that the knowledge of the ancients, which had been the gold standard since the Renaissance, was wrong. And so by 1700, Europeans were profoundly questioning and even setting aside their classical tradition in favor of new modes of seeking and validating knowledge in a way that other major civilizations were not yet willing to do at that time. And I think that is also part of the divergence story that plays a very critical role going forward. Stop it.